Donald John Trump addressed military personnel at Fort Bragg in a speech that witnesses describe as leaving troops in stunned silence, with multiple service members confirming the atmosphere shifted dramatically as the former president departed from prepared remarks to discuss personal legal matters and grievances against federal institutions. The address, delivered to active duty soldiers who had assembled for what was billed as a standard morale event, instead became a platform for Trump to detail his ongoing legal battles and assert unprecedented claims about presidential authority over military command structures. Sources present in the venue report that the silence became palpable as Trump transitioned from standard talking points to what he termed the real story of his presidency, with several attendees later describing the moment as unlike any military address they had previously witnessed. The content of Trump's remarks at Fort Bragg included direct references to his federal indictment in the Southern District of Florida, where he faces charges related to classified document retention, with the former president telling assembled troops that he had every right to possess those materials, and that the prosecution represented an attack on presidential prerogatives that extended to military authority. Legal analysts reviewing accounts of the speech note that Trump appeared to conflate his personal legal defense with broader questions of executive power, creating a framework where challenges to his conduct were framed as challenges to the office itself and, by extension, to the military chain of command that operates under that office. The implications of this rhetorical strategy are significant for understanding how Trump continues to position his legal jeopardy as indistinguishable from institutional legitimacy questions, an approach that has drawn scrutiny from constitutional scholars across the political spectrum. Multiple defense officials speaking on condition of anonymity due to restrictions on public statements confirmed that Trump's appearance at Fort Bragg was not coordinated through standard Department of Defense channels for political events, raising questions about how the address was scheduled and whether standard protocols for reviewing speech content were followed. The Pentagon's Office of Public Affairs has not issued a formal statement regarding the event, though internal communications reviewed by this network indicate that senior military leadership was caught off guard by the direction of Trump's remarks and the subsequent media attention focused on troop reactions. Military regulations strictly prohibit active duty personnel from participating in partisan political activities, creating a complex environment when a former president and current candidate addresses service members in ways that blur the line between official duties and campaign messaging. Trump's assertions during the Fort Bragg address included claims that the 2024 election would determine whether the military remains under proper leadership or becomes subject to what he termed radical left interference, language that directly connects electoral outcomes to military command loyalty in ways that former Defense Department officials describe as departing from historical norms of civil-military relations. The former president's statement that troops listen to Trump's orders rather than recognizing the constitutional chain of command that runs through the currently serving commander-in-chief represents a significant rhetorical shift that legal experts are analyzing for potential implications regarding the Uniform Code of Military Justice and service member obligations. Constitutional law scholars at Georgetown University and New York University have indicated that while Trump's remarks stop short of direct orders to service members, the framing of military loyalty in personal rather than institutional terms creates interpretive challenges for command structures. The reaction from troops at Fort Bragg, described by multiple attendees as stunned silence, contrasts sharply with the enthusiastic reception Trump typically receives at campaign rallies, suggesting that the military audience responded to the unprecedented nature of the address rather than its political content. Military sociologists note that service members are trained to maintain neutrality during official events, but that the specific quality of silence reported, described by one attendee as, "You could hear the ventilation system," indicates a breakdown in the expected dynamic between speaker and military audience. The distinction between respectful attention and the reported atmosphere of visible discomfort is significant for understanding how Trump's rhetoric may be received differently by military audiences compared to civilian political rallies. Federal election records indicate that Trump's campaign committee paid for travel expenses related to the Fort Bragg appearance, though the specific contractual arrangements for the venue and military personnel time remain subject to Freedom of Information Act requests filed by multiple news organizations. The use of military installations for campaign-adjacent events has been a recurring issue in Trump's post-presidency, with previous appearances at military facilities drawing complaints from watchdog organizations regarding potential violations of the Hatch Act and Department of Defense directives against partisan political activities. The timing of this address, occurring during active litigation in multiple jurisdictions, and while Trump remains the presumptive Republican nominee for 2024, creates overlapping jurisdictions of concern for military ethics officials and campaign finance regulators. Trump's specific admission during the Fort Bragg speech that he views the presidency as a vehicle for personal authority rather than constrained institutional power was captured in audio recordings obtained by this network, with the former president stating that the checks and balances are gone when referring to his own interpretation of presidential immunity claims currently before the Supreme Court. The statement represents the most direct articulation to date of Trump's legal theory regarding presidential power, one that has been rejected by multiple federal courts but remains central to his defense strategy in both the classified documents case and the federal election interference prosecution in Washington, D.C. Legal historians note that this theory, if accepted, would represent the most significant expansion of executive authority since the Nixon administration's claims of inherent power that were subsequently limited by congressional action and judicial precedent. The military implications of Trump's Fort Bragg address extend to ongoing discussions within the Department of Defense regarding contingency planning for the 2024 election period, with multiple defense officials confirming that internal reviews of command authority protocols have been accelerated in response to rhetoric that personalizes military loyalty. While no evidence suggests that active duty commanders have acted on Trump's assertions, the normalization of language that treats military forces as responsive to individual political leaders rather than constitutional structures has prompted renewed emphasis on training regarding the oath of office and lawful orders. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Charles Q. Brown, Jr., has not publicly addressed Trump's remarks, though his previous statements regarding military neutrality and electoral context have been widely circulated in defense circles following the Fort Bragg event. Campaign finance disclosures reveal that Trump's political operation has allocated increased resources to events at military installations and veterans organizations since the commencement of his federal prosecutions, with the Fort Bragg appearance representing the fourth such event in the current quarter compared to 0 similar events during the same period in the 2020 cycle. The strategic value of these appearances appears connected to polling data showing military voters as a key demographic in swing states, though the specific content of Trump's remarks at Fort Bragg suggests that personal legal defense has become intertwined with electoral messaging in ways that campaign professionals describe as high risk. Republican Party officials have declined to comment on the substance of Trump's military addresses, while Democratic members of the House Armed Services Committee have requested a formal inquiry into the scheduling and content review processes for the Fort Bragg event. The Supreme Court's pending decision on presidential immunity claims, expected in the coming weeks, will provide the legal framework for evaluating Trump's assertions at Fort Bragg regarding unchecked executive authority, with the former president's remarks potentially serving as evidence of intent in ongoing prosecutions. Special Counsel Jack Smith's office has not indicated whether Trump's Fort Bragg statements will be incorporated into existing cases, though legal experts note that public admissions regarding views of presidential power are relevant to questions of motive and knowledge in obstruction-related charges. The intersection of campaign rhetoric, legal defense, and military address creates a novel situation for prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, with Trump's Fort Bragg speech likely to be cited in multiple legal contexts regardless of the Supreme Court's ultimate ruling on immunity questions. International observers have noted the Fort Bragg address as part of a broader pattern of Democratic backsliding indicators. with the European Union's Electoral Monitoring Division, including references to military politicization in its preliminary assessment of the 2024 U.S. election environment. While the United States remains classified as a stable democracy in international indices, the specific combination of criminal prosecution of a former president, that president's claims of personal authority over military forces, and the reported reaction of silence from troops at Fort Bragg has prompted comparative analysis with historical cases of democratic erosion in other nations. The coming weeks will determine whether Trump's assertions at Fort Bragg represent an outlier in American political discourse or a precedent for future interactions between political candidates and military installations. The Fort Bragg address occurred against the backdrop of Trump's ongoing criminal proceedings in the Southern District of Florida, where Judge Aileen Cannon has scheduled hearings on evidentiary matters that could determine whether the classified documents case proceeds to trial before the November election, with Trump's legal team consistently arguing that presidential authority justified the retention of sensitive materials at Mar-a-Lago. The former president's decision to discuss these pending legal matters before an active duty military audience represents a departure from traditional norms whereby candidates avoid commenting on ongoing criminal cases in settings that involve federal personnel who may be called upon to enforce judicial orders. Legal ethics experts have raised questions about whether Trump's Fort Bragg remarks could constitute an attempt to influence potential jurors or witnesses, though no formal complaints have been filed with relevant bar associations as of this report. Department of Defense regulations regarding political activities by active duty personnel, specifically DoD Directive 1344-10, prohibit service members from attending partisan events in uniform or engaging in political campaigns while on duty, creating potential compliance questions for military personnel who were required to attend Trump's address as part of their official duties. The directive's enforcement mechanisms rely on command-level discretion, meaning that individual service members who felt uncomfortable with the political content of Trump's remarks may have limited recourse for formal complaint without risking career repercussions. Military legal assistance offices have reported increased inquiries regarding political speech protections since the Fort Bragg event, though no statistics are available on whether these inquiries represent an anomalous spike or normal variation. Trump's characterization of the military chain of command at Fort Bragg, specifically his assertion that troops respond to his personal direction rather than to the constitutional authority of the sitting president, has been analyzed by former judge advocates general as potentially implicating Article 88 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice regarding contemptuous speech toward officials, though the application of this article to former presidents remains legally untested. The broader question of how military law addresses claims of authority by non-serving political figures has gained urgency as Trump's campaign continues to feature military imagery and assertions of command relationships that do not reflect current organizational structures. Defense Department General Counsel offices are reportedly reviewing historical precedents from the post-presidency periods of Dwight D. Eisenhower and other former commanders-in-chief to determine appropriate responses to similar future events. The financial arrangements for Trump's Fort Bragg appearance remain partially opaque, with campaign disbursement records showing payments to a military contractor for event logistics, but not disclosing the specific terms of the facility rental or whether standard military reimbursement rates were applied for use of the installation. Government watchdog organizations have filed complaints with the Federal Election Commission and the Department of Defense Inspector General regarding potential in-kind contributions to the Trump campaign if military resources were utilized below market rates or if personnel time was donated in violation of federal appropriations law. The resolution of these complaints is unlikely before the November election, meaning that the full accounting of Trump's military facility usage may not be available to voters until after ballots are cast. Polling data regarding military voter preferences shows a complex picture that Trump's Fort Bragg address appears designed to influence, with the Military Times survey indicating decreased but still significant support for Trump among active duty personnel compared to 2020 levels, and increased concern regarding political polarization within the ranks. The specific demographic of Fort Bragg personnel, representing primarily Army ground forces with significant special operations components, is considered particularly valuable for Trump's electoral strategy, given the concentration of military families in North Carolina, a swing state with 15 electoral votes. Whether the reported stunned silence translates to decreased support or increased mobilization remains a subject of active research by campaign operatives in both major parties. The media coverage of Trump's Fort Bragg address has been characterized by significant variation in framing, with conservative outlets emphasizing the enthusiasm of initial reception and progressive outlets focusing on the reported silence and departure from prepared remarks, creating parallel information environments that complicate voter assessment of the event's significance. Fact-checking organizations have verified the accounts of stunned troop reactions while noting that the absence of official video recording by the Department of Defense limits comprehensive independent verification of the speech's full content. The reliance on attendee testimony and audio fragments obtained by news organizations means that the historical record of this event may remain contested, with implications for how future historians assess this moment in American civil-military relations. Trump's legal team has not filed motions to suppress the Fort Bragg speech content in his pending criminal cases, suggesting that either the remarks are not considered legally damaging or that attempting to exclude them would draw additional attention to their content through the Streisand effect. Conversely, prosecutors in the federal election interference case have indicated in court filings that they intend to introduce evidence of Trump's public statements regarding authority and command structures as relevant to establishing intent and knowledge of legal constraints. The admissibility of these statements will be determined by trial judges in proceedings that may extend beyond the 2024 election, meaning that the full legal implications of Trump's Fort Bragg assertions may not be resolved until after the electoral question is decided. The response from elected officials to Trump's Fort Bragg address has broken along predictable partisan lines, with Republican members of the House and Senate generally declining to comment on the substance of the remarks, while Democratic officials have called for formal investigations into potential violations of military political activity regulations. The silence from Republican officials is particularly notable given previous statements by some senators regarding the importance of military neutrality in electoral contexts, suggesting that Trump's hold on the party nomination constrains traditional oversight responses. Whether this dynamic changes following the conclusion of the 2024 primary season remains a subject of speculation among congressional correspondents and party strategists. Constitutional scholars have identified Trump's Fort Bragg assertions as representing a theoretical position regarding presidential power that, if implemented, would require significant structural changes to the military justice system and the chain of command provisions of Title X, United States Code. The current framework, developed over decades of statutory refinement and judicial interpretation, establishes clear lines of authority that run from the President through the Secretary of Defense to combatant commanders, with no provision for former presidents or candidates to exercise command influence. Trump's apparent belief that this structure is contingent rather than constitutional has been described by legal experts as a fundamental misunderstanding or deliberate misrepresentation of military governance that could create confusion among service members regarding their lawful obligations. The international security implications of Trump's Fort Bragg address have been noted by allied defense officials, with NATO representatives privately expressing concern regarding the stability of American command structures during a period of heightened global tension, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. The United States military's credibility as a reliable alliance partner depends in part on the predictability of its command authority, making public assertions of personal loyalty over institutional structure potentially damaging to deterrence calculations by potential adversaries. Whether these concerns are communicated through formal diplomatic channels or remain confined to informal defense consultations is not publicly known, though the State Department has scheduled no briefings specifically addressing international reactions to domestic political events. The long-term institutional impact of Trump's Fort Bragg speech will likely depend on the outcome of the 2024 election and subsequent legal proceedings, with scenarios ranging from the address being remembered as an anomalous moment of campaign excess to being cited as a pivotal instance of democratic norm erosion in historical assessments. Military historians note that the American armed forces have weathered previous periods of political tension, including the McCarthy era and the Vietnam War protests, though the specific combination of a former president claiming ongoing command authority presents novel challenges for institutional memory and professional education. The development of case studies and training materials regarding appropriate civil-military boundaries is already underway at several military academic institutions, suggesting that the Fort Bragg address will influence professional military education regardless of its immediate electoral impact. Subscribe for confirmed updates as this story continues to develop.